When I was a child, my family used to go on Easter egg hunts in the nearby woods. We would all gather together, and my parents would hide the eggs while my siblings and I waited patiently. One year, my older brother and I decided to go on our own egg hunt while our parents were still setting up. We wandered deep into the woods, eager to find the perfect hiding spots for our eggs. As we were walking, we heard a faint humming sound. At first, we thought it was just a bird or an insect, but the closer we got, the louder it became. It sounded like someone was singing, but it was too high-pitched and distorted to make out any words. We followed the sound, and it led us to a clearing in the woods. In the center of the clearing was a strange figure, dressed in a tattered bunny suit. Its face was obscured by a mask, but it was clear that it was not a friendly Easter bunny. The figure was holding a basket of eggs, but they were not the brightly colored plastic eggs we were used to finding. These were real, raw eggs, and they were covered in strange symbols and markings. My brother and I froze in terror as the figure turned towards us. It let out a shrill laugh that echoed through the woods, and then it vanished into thin air. We ran back to our parents, screaming about the strange figure we had seen in the woods. They didn't believe us at first, but when we showed them the strange eggs we had found, they knew that something was wrong. To this day, I don't know what that figure was or what it wanted, but I do know that I never went on an Easter egg hunt in the woods again. Story 2. It was Easter Sunday, and my family and I had just finished attending church. We were all dressed in our finest clothes and were looking forward to a big feast at my grandmother's house. As we were driving down the winding country roads to my grandmother's house, we noticed a strange figure walking along the side of the road. It was dressed in a tattered bunny suit, and its face was obscured by a mask. At first, we thought it was just someone dressed up for Easter, but as we got closer, we could see that something was wrong. The figure was walking with a strange gait, almost as if it was limping. As we passed by, the figure turned and stared at us with its cold, lifeless eyes. It was then that we realized that this was not a person in a bunny suit, but something far more sinister. My father hit the gas, and we sped away from the figure as quickly as we could. But it wasn't long before we saw it again, this time in the middle of the road, blocking our path. My father swerved to avoid hitting the figure, but as we passed by, it let out a blood-curdling scream that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. We finally arrived at my grandmother's house, but the figure was still following us. It stood outside the window, watching us with its lifeless eyes as we ate our Easter dinner. We were all too afraid to go outside, so we spent the night huddled together in my grandmother's living room, listening to the figure's haunting screams echoing through the woods. The next morning, the figure was gone, and we never saw it again. But the memory of that Easter Sunday will stay with me for the rest of my life. Story 3. It was a beautiful Easter morning, and my family and I decided to take a walk in the park to enjoy the spring weather. As we were walking, we noticed a group of people gathered around a large, ornate Easter egg display. The display was filled with dozens of intricately painted eggs, each one more beautiful than the last. But as we got closer, we noticed something strange about the eggs. They were all cracked, and there was something moving inside. We looked closer and saw that the eggs were filled with tiny, writhing creatures that looked like spiders but had the wings of a moth. They were crawling over each other, making strange, clicking noises. Suddenly, the creatures burst out of the eggs, swarming over the people gathered around the display. The creatures began to attack, biting and stinging anyone in their path. My family and I ran for our lives, but the creatures were too fast. They were everywhere, crawling up our legs and biting us with their sharp mandibles. We finally managed to escape the park, but the creatures followed us home. They crawled through the windows and the vents, infesting our house and turning it into a living nightmare. We tried everything to get rid of them, from insecticides to fire, but nothing seemed to work. It was as if the creatures were invincible, and they were determined to destroy us. In the end, we had no choice but to abandon our home and flee for our lives. We never returned to that park again, and to this day, I still have nightmares about the writhing, clicking creatures that haunted our Easter. Story 4. When I was a child, my family and I used to spend Easter weekend at my grandparents' old farm. It was a sprawling property with a big red barn, fields of tall grass, and a pond that shimmered in the sun. One Easter Sunday, my siblings and I decided to explore the woods at the edge of the property. We had never been allowed to venture too far into the woods before, but today, we felt brave. As we walked deeper into the woods, we began to hear strange noises. At first, it was just the rustling of leaves and twigs, but then we heard something else. It was a low, guttural growl, like an animal in pain. We followed the sound until we came to a clearing. In the center of the clearing was a large, stone altar with a wreath of flowers hanging over it, and on the altar was a giant, intricately painted Easter egg. We were in awe of the egg, but as we got closer, we realized that something was very wrong. The egg was pulsating, and there was a strange, sickly odor emanating from it. Suddenly, the egg cracked open, revealing a dark, gaping hole, and out of the hole crawled a writhing, wriggling mass of maggots. We tried to run, but we were surrounded by the maggots. They crawled over our feet and up our legs, making us sick with their stench. As we tried to escape, we heard a low, mournful wail coming from the woods. We turned to look, and we saw a ghostly figure dressed in a tattered bunny suit, its eyes filled with tears. We ran back to the farm as fast as we could, but the figure followed us. It stood outside the windows, watching us as we ate our Easter dinner, and it haunted our dreams for weeks afterwards. To this day, I don't know what we saw in those woods, but I know that it was something evil, and I'll never forget the terror of that Easter Sunday, when we came face to face with the darkness that lurks just beneath the surface of our world. Story 5. My family and I always celebrated Easter with a big feast at my grandmother's house. We would gather around the table, sharing stories and laughing, and the air would be filled with the sweet smell of freshly baked bread and roasted meat. One Easter, however, things took a dark turn. As we were sitting down to eat, my grandmother suddenly slumped over in her chair. We rushed to her side, but she was unresponsive. We called for an ambulance, but it was too late. My grandmother had passed away right there at the Easter table. The next year, we tried to carry on the tradition of the Easter feast, but it was never the same. There was a heaviness in the air, a sense of grief and loss that we couldn't shake. One evening, as we were cleaning up after dinner, we heard a strange noise coming from the kitchen. It sounded like someone tapping on the window. When we looked out, we saw a figure standing in the yard, dressed in a tattered bunny suit. Its face was obscured by a hood, but we could feel its eyes boring into us. We tried to ignore it, but the figure kept coming back, night after night. Sometimes it would tap on the windows, other times it would scratch at the door. We were too afraid to confront it, too afraid to even leave the house after dark. One Easter Sunday, we decided to confront the figure. We armed ourselves with kitchen knives and went outside to face it. But when we got outside, the figure was nowhere to be seen. We searched the yard, the neighborhood, even the nearby woods, but there was no sign of the figure. It had disappeared, as suddenly as it had appeared. To this day, we don't know what that figure was or what it wanted from us, but we always feel its presence around Easter time. And we can't help but wonder if it's connected to my grandmother's sudden passing. Story 6. When I was a child, my family and I always spent Easter weekend at my grandmother's house. She had a big backyard with an old wooden shed where she kept all her gardening tools. I loved exploring the shed and looking at all the old tools and trinkets she had collected over the years. One Easter, when I was about 10 years old, my cousin and I were playing hide and seek in the backyard. I decided to hide in the shed, thinking my cousin would never find me there. As I was crouched down, trying to be as quiet as possible, I heard a strange noise coming from one of the corners of the shed. I slowly turned my head and saw something that made my blood run cold. There was a large, rabbit-like creature crouched in the corner, its eyes glowing red in the dim light. It had long, sharp teeth and its fur was matted and dirty. I tried to scream, but no sound would come out. The creature began to move towards me, its eyes fixed on me the whole time. I felt trapped and helpless, unsure of what to do. Suddenly, my cousin burst into the shed, looking for me. As soon as he saw the creature, he screamed and ran out of the shed. I followed him, stumbling and tripping over my own feet. When we got to the house, we told our parents what had happened, but they didn't believe us. They thought we were just trying to scare each other. But I know what I saw in that shed. And every Easter since then, I've been too scared to go back to my grandmother's house. Story 7. When I was in college, I decided to spend Easter break in New Orleans with a group of friends. We rented a big old house in the French Quarter and spent our days exploring the city and our nights partying on Bourbon Street. One night, after a particularly wild evening, we stumbled back to the house in the early hours of the morning. As we were settling in for the night, we heard a strange noise coming from one of the bedrooms upstairs. It sounded like someone was moving furniture around. We all froze, unsure of what to do. We tried to convince ourselves that it was just the old house settling, or maybe a neighbor making noise. but the sounds continued, growing louder and more intense. Finally, one of my friends worked up the courage to go investigate. She climbed the stairs slowly, her flashlight shaking in her hand. When she reached the top of the stairs, she saw a figure standing in the hallway. It was a tall, thin man with pale skin and black eyes. He was dressed in an old-fashioned suit, and his hair was slicked back in a greasy ponytail. He didn't say anything, but just stood there, staring at her with those black eyes. My friend screamed and ran back down the stairs, and we all huddled together in the living room, too scared to move. The sounds continued throughout the night, and we were all too terrified to get any sleep. The next day, we went to a local voodoo shop and spoke to a woman who claimed to be a medium. She told us that the house we were staying in was built on the site of an old plantation, and that the man we had seen was the ghost of the plantation owner, who had been murdered by his slaves. We left New Orleans that day, too scared to stay another night in the haunted house. To this day, I still get chills thinking about that Easter break in the French Quarter.